We know that without doubt, viral outbreaks have negative effects, and we know that without doubt, human isolation and economic downfalls have negative effects. So the obvious thing to do would be to compare these two and try to find a balance, but for some reason people seem to think that any concern about, say, isolation either delegitimizes or dunks on COVID concerns. And it doesn't do either. Two things can be true at once. Have we been too relaxed on lockdown restrictions? Have the restrictions caused more harm than good? These are the questions I'm sure as hell not going to be able to answer today, because I'm not a virologist, I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm not an economist, and I'm not an astrologist, but I still think it's worth having a discussion. So with that out of the way, did 5G cause COVID? Let's talk about the lockdowns. I forgot to put an intro in, so I'll just put my cartoon here. COVID case numbers are difficult to track. It depends on the number of tests done, the accuracy of the testing, the effectiveness of targeting regions and demographics, and even the willingness of people to want to get tested. Death numbers are also difficult to track because of unreported deaths, clear faults in what some countries consider a COVID death, and even possibly inflation or hiding of stats from countries for political reasons. In the case of China, I'll remove the word possibly from that sentence. And on top of that, our media ranges from constantly hyperbolic with the pure intention of giving us all a fucking heart attack every morning to straight out denial of a virus and fear that somehow 5G devices are infinitely more deadly than 4th generation devices. Wait till they hear what generation iPhones are on. So even if suddenly these stats were easy to calculate, what do you think the chances are that we'd get objective, unmoderated coverage of it? So for that reason, I'm going to try to stick to mainly discussions and not dive too heavily into stats. All numbers I use will be from articles, which I'll link below, but that doesn't necessarily mean I 100% trust the articles or sources. Now, from a health concern, the first thing I'm going to look at is isolation. Solitary confinement is considered terrifying punishment in prison, as in you're locked in a cage with gang members, rapists, murderers, and a bunch of guards, and the worst thing they can do is lock you in a cage by yourself. Isolation alone obviously leads to a host of issues, from increased stress, increased drug and alcohol consumption, increased aggressive behaviour, decreases in physical activity, and no doubt a host of other things I can't think of. In Australia, we've had around 1,200 suicides since March, and while any number above zero is horrific, with 3,000 suicides a year, this is about what we expect in that time frame. One key factor with mental health, like COVID, it's an ongoing struggle. It's ridiculous to look 6 months into a recession or pandemic and say, oh well, there's no huge spike, so everyone's fine. Beyond Blue is a mental health support line that's received 66% more calls than they did this time last year. And modelling at the University of Sydney's Brain and Mind Centre warns that this COVID period alone will cause an extra 1,500 deaths a year for the next 5 years in what they call a generational mental health crisis. Another serious issue is people who have neglected their other health concerns because of the fear of COVID. We've seen huge drops in heart attack emissions, stroke imaging, and no doubt a host of other chronic illnesses that people have left inadequately cared for because of a fear of COVID. It's as though since they heard there was a virus, they just said, oh, what a relief. I find myself worrying about COVID so much, I don't even think about my blood pressure. Anyway, this is barely scratching the surface, but suicide and life-threatening illnesses are bumming me out, so let's talk about something more fun. Now, if you look at the economic side, you'll see there is no sides, because obviously our economy and our health are linked. No matter how well I try to put it, I will never articulate it quite as well as this.
This notion, though, that you can just sort of send checks out to everybody and things will be fine is not true. Now, let me just break it to you, the fools out there. If you don't make stuff, there's no stuff.
As a society, we all serve a function so other people don't have to worry about that part of their lives. So somebody will grow the vegetables, somebody will bake the bread, somebody will make sure you have water, electricity, gas, new Gucci flip-flops. If a majority or even a notable proportion of these people suddenly were unable to perform their function, where are you going to get your Gucci flip-flops? There's no better example of this than the UN report that says at least 265 million people will be pushed to the brink of starvation by the COVID-19 crisis, doubling the number under threat before the pandemic. So just to clarify there, if the UN is correct, which I know is not a bulletproof way to start a sentence, but if they are, economic failures caused by COVID responses will cause more people to be pushed to the brink of starvation this year than deaths in World War I and II combined. Business closure is another obvious issue. I've seen memes about plane companies going down who charge an extra $30 for a kilo of luggage, and there's a sense of karma to it. But the reality of the situation is there's thousands of people out of the job and there's less access to a service which we needed. The value of keeping a business open isn't to keep the boss happy. It's to keep the workforce employed, to keep the economy running, and to maintain our access to Gucci flip-flop. Now, the fun part. What would have happened if we'd done nothing? Well, firstly, we'd see more COVID. I'm not advocating for or against any particular restriction, but it's unquestionable that more exposure leads to more infection. Good hygiene practices and social distancing will reduce the spread of infectious agents almost by definition. Sweden obviously went for the natural immunity approach, and they've definitely had more COVID-related fatalities. Definitely. If we adjust for population size, we would have around 14,300 rather than 740. Sweden is a lot more dense than Australia, but I think because we have so much open area and densely populated cities, I don't know how relevant this is. The other factor to consider is that while COVID does have a relatively low mortality rate, there would be serious issues if our hospital systems were overrun and we had to start restricting resources. We don't have infinite resources there either. And before somebody says, oh, but hospitals are only at 30% capacity, yes, but majority of hospitals aren't equipped to deal with emergency care situations. Medicine isn't one homogenous business. Some areas, like elective surgery, have been heavily reduced, while other areas will obviously be struggling. We also definitely haven't ruled out reinfection, so natural immunity may not be a viable option. Natural immunity is just where a high enough proportion of the population have antibodies to this virus, so the virus is unable to spread. But if the virus is changing and the antibodies are no longer effective, then the virus spread will continue. This is why we get a flu vaccine every year. It's a mix of the most prominent strains of flu in the hope to heavily reduce the spread. Overall, the current global death toll is around 875,000. And while I said these figures are purely for discussion purposes, I think what's undeniable is more contact and less hygiene practices will only increase these numbers more. So is the cure worse than the disease? To be fair, the cure being worse than disease isn't unheard of for humans. Isn't that what all invasive species are? Didn't we make plastic bags as environmentally friendly alternatives to cutting down trees for paper bags? Like, I'm not saying that this is necessarily the case, but it's definitely not out of character. If the UN article is correct, then on death count scale, I'd say it's inevitable, but I don't even know if death counts are the ultimate goal. Like, if the goal is to enforce any rule that decreases death count, then why can't we buy cigarettes or alcohol or fast food for that matter? It just comes down to what level of freedom you're willing to give up for safety. Also, the question is raised that if a virus with a 1% mortality rate is justification for our government to lock our businesses, give us an 8 p.m. curfew, arrest us in our houses for Facebook posts, then what level of freedom did we have to begin with? Side note here, but if we can only protest things the government let us protest, who are we protesting? I think what's missed here is the individuals affected. There are people who have lost friends and family to a disease which appears preventable. And there are people who have worked hard to build a business only to have their livelihood taken away, along with everyone they'd taken on as workers. From where I stand, I can say with certainty that I believe community effort should be taken to reduce the spread in order to protect those of us who are immunosuppressed. I can also say that I do not believe indefinitely closing businesses until a vaccine comes out is a viable option for many people or the economy. So where does that leave us? Well, from a government level, I wouldn't even begin to try to work out what's acceptable, but I'd say it has to be correlated to COVID and consistent. Different things are essential to different people. We've seen people fined for washing their cars, while tens of thousands of people can go to protests or sporting events with no issue. To be fair, I think the man washing his car was let off, but by that point, the public's already lost confidence. In the US, there's recently been a story where a hair salon owner who's been forced to close down for months has had to open exclusively so Nancy Pelosi can get a wash and blow wave. And regardless of what happened here, the people see this as rules for thee and not for me, and immediately stop following them. To be fair though, if you're around Joe Biden all day, having good smelling hair is high on your priority list. Also, an explanation would help. People really don't understand the correlation between a viral spread and an 8 p.m. curfew. Fact is though, what to do politically is easy. Nothing. I can't do shit, and most of you can't either. If you're concerned about mental health, or business closure, or uncared illnesses, reach out to the people around you, support local businesses as much as you can, and encourage people to go see their doctors, because deaths to anything preventable is tragic. If you're worried about infectious spread and people not wearing masks, don't yell at them because it doesn't work. It only causes them to be less likely to wear a mask, which increases the chance of spread and therefore death. It's not a great trade-off so you can feel morally superior. And that's not just speculation either. There's plenty of studies that back this up, but if you don't want to look up proof to see that yelling and name-calling doesn't work, just take a look at every election for the last 4 years. I think the TLDR here is just don't be dicks. Both positions are ones of compassion. Everyone's going through shit right now, but being hostile to each other only increases the chances of mental illness and decreases social cohesion, which is the basis behind all community health efforts. So what do? Well, if by we, I mean the people who spend their days watching YouTube, then the best thing we can do is probably reach out to the people around us and try to make this difficult time a little bit less difficult. I definitely don't want to be ending all my videos with some preachy How I Met Your Mother lesson, but I think particularly during this craziness, it's far too easy to get caught up finger pointing instead of just thinking what we can do to make it easier for us and the people around us. Anyway, that's the end. Thanks for watching. The subscribe button is below. Big thank you to everyone subscribed off my first video. I wasn't expecting so much love off a 5-minute video about baby birds, so I appreciate it. If you do have anything you want talked about or anything you want to add to this, welcome to discuss below, but please, in the spirit of the channel, try to talk about the ideas and not attack the people.